this is what we're going to cover tonight. We're going to take a very brief look at the history of the book, look at some of the characters in the book, talk about reaction from the black community then as well as now, look at the N-word and other epithets that are in the book, talk about a few controversies surrounding the book, and then talk lastly about present-day relevance of To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay? So, I do want to make sure that everyone is aware of this. The way I do the Q&A is I've handed out index cards. Anyone who hasn't gotten one that wants one, I'll just pass some back. But I prefer to have you guys write questions during the course of the presentation, because what happens is you may think of something 5 minutes from now, and then 45 minutes later, oh, it's gone. It's disappeared from your brain. And so what I like you to do is jot down those questions, and then at the end, you guys will hand those questions to me, and I'll do my best to answer them as best I can. So if anyone needs index cards, or one, that's all I have left. I used a bunch of those last night, so I apologize that I'm out. So if anyone has one that they don't plan on using, that's great. So anyway, that's the Q&A procedure, which we'll do at the end. So let's talk about the book, To Kill a Mockingbird. It won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1961. And these are just a few things that were written about the book in southern localities right after the book was written. The Mobile Press Register called the book a wonderfully absorbing story, while acknowledging that the novel will come under some fire in the Deep South. They felt that there were some things about the book that would really be very controversial. The Birmingham News said the novel assures the author a place well up front among American writers, is down to earth and believable. And Time magazine said the novel is an account of an awakening to good and evil. So these are some of the things that were said, pretty much universally positive reviews of the book. People love the book. It sold, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 million copies over the course of its life. It's never gone out of print, and it's just as popular today as it was in 1960. People love the book. This is Harper Lee. The first image is her. Around the time that she published the book, she became kind of, she didn't really like the attention that she got from the book. She was kind of a recluse, so she kind of stayed out of the limelight. She didn't give interviews or things of that nature. She preferred to have that peace and quiet. This is a picture that was taken, I believe, 2 months before she passed away. And she was just as energetic then as she was early, other than a few medical issues. And so that's Harper Lee. The town is the town that she grew up in. So she talked about the town that she grew up in. Yeah, okay, so let's move on. Some of the main characters that were talked about in the book. Scout, who is our narrator, the protagonist of the book. Jim, her older brother. Their dad, Atticus Finch, is the hero of the book. Calpurnia is an African-American employee of the family. She's their housekeeper, their cook, caregiver. Tom Robinson is a man that Atticus will eventually defend in court. Mr. Uhl and his daughter, Mayella, will be the people that accuse him of a crime that Atticus will have to defend him for in the end. So those are some of the main characters in the book. So I believe that in order to take a look at this book, you have to look at it in context, okay? And I believe that for the most part, we haven't really done that as Americans. We've read the book, we've talked about the book since it was written in 1960. But one of the things that I don't think has happened very often is people haven't looked at the context. And I believe it's important to look at the context of 3 separate time periods. I believe it's important to look at 1935, which is a year that those events were happening in the book. Also 1960, the year the book was published, and obviously 2015. And so the approach that I'm taking tonight is to kind of put the book into the context so that we can examine those times, those events that happened, the people that were involved on those, in the place where they lived when those events were occurring. Because we oftentimes look at the past and judge people by our standards of today. So we're going to talk about how that really does a disservice when you're talking about the book. One of my core beliefs is that we teach American history very poorly. I'm a teacher. I don't teach American history, I teach math. But I've seen a lot of people teach American history, including the teachers that I had, and I think we do a very poor job. And the reason I say that isn't that we don't know what we're doing, it's there are limits to what we can teach typically. The way social studies books are written, the way they're designed, and you can go to any country and they're designed the same way. You can go to France, you can go to Jamaica, wherever you go. They're designed to make the people that study these things become what? I heard someone give an answer.
Patriotic.
Exactly. They want you to be patriotic. They don't want you to feel bad about the country that you live in. So they give you the perspective that will tend to push you to be a very patriotic person. That does a disservice to the history though. Because if you go back to some of the things the founding fathers said, they said, and Thomas Jefferson was a big proponent of this, he said that you have to question your government. You have to consistently stay on their case and question everything they do. Otherwise, they'll do whatever they want to do instead of what you want them to do. And so what we do is, as a society, we tend to overlook those ugly things and just talk about the beautiful things. We talk about the rose bush, but we don't talk about the weeds. So I believe that in order to really get deep into this book, get a deep understanding, you have to look at the weeds also. So we're going to talk about the rose bushes as well as the weeds tonight. Let's go back to the 1930s. It's a very turbulent time in American history. We're in the beginning phases of the Great Depression. As far as racial things are going, this is a very, very difficult time for African Americans to be living in the United States. And I'll just share with you a few things. The Ku Klux Klan was in their heyday. Let me give you a brief background of the Ku Klux Klan. Ku Klux Klan actually stands for Circle of Friends. It started as this kind of fraternal order. Some former Confederate soldiers started this organization with the intent of getting back to where they were before the war started, to getting back to a position where they could maintain control over blacks. Even though they'd been given their freedom, they still wanted to maintain that same level of control over them that they had over them when they were enslaved. And so the purpose of the Klan was to terrorize blacks, make sure that they could not take advantage of any of these new rights they had been given, make sure they couldn't vote, make sure they couldn't find jobs, all of these different things. And they went on the warpath, literally. They were so violent that the federal government actually outlawed them. They passed a law called the Anti-Klan Act because that's how much terror they had brought. And I've heard many people talk about 9/11, the events of 9/11, and say that this was, terrorism. America's never seen terrorism before on its own grounds. Well, I would definitely disagree with that. These people were extremely terroristic. I called them America's first organized terrorist group. They were so violent that the federal government outlawed them and they went away. They came back in 1915 stronger than they had ever been, and they became a group that was very outspoken against blacks, against Jews, and against Catholics. They wanted America to be completely a Protestant nation. They wanted all the Catholics kicked out of the country. They wanted all the blacks removed from the country. They wanted all of the Jews removed from the country. This is what they espoused. And so at that particular time, they had larger membership than they had ever had before. They had a huge rally in Washington, D.C. in 1926, and they were in every single state. There was not a single state that they didn't have a huge presence in. Indiana was the largest presence they had. They had more Klan members per capita in Indiana than any other state. So, they were there bothering blacks. They were part of some of these lynchings that took place. There were 20 blacks lynched in 1930, including Dr. Cameron's two friends, Abe and Tommy. In 1931, 12 blacks were lynched. 1932, there were 6. 1933, there were 24. 1934, 15. And 18 in 1935. These are just documented lynchings. There were probably several others that were never documented, but this is from the documentation that was kept. So you can see that at this particular time, around the time that the book was written, these were things that blacks were dealing with. They were dealing with this terrorist organization, Ku Klux Klan. They were dealing with the fear of being lynched at any given moment. They were dealing with the Great Depression. It was not a very good time for blacks. And it wasn't really a very good time for most whites because the Great Depression really did tremendous damage to the economy, and it really took about 20 years nearly 20 years for the economy to get back to where it was before. In fact, had it not been for World War II and all of the jobs that were created as a result of that war, the economy would have never really picked back up the steam that it had lost. So go back to the 1960s, and I'm sure that you guys are familiar with the murder of Emmett Till in 1955 in Money, Mississippi. That little town is about less than 20 miles away from where I was born in Mississippi, a little town called Charleston, Mississippi. And so he flirted with a white woman in a store. He was down visiting relatives. He was from Chicago. He didn't really know the rules, and he violated one of those rules, and he ended up losing his life. So in addition to that, these are some events that occurred in 1960. Some of these you may be familiar with, some you've probably never heard of. The Georgia governor threatened to withhold funds from integrated schools in 1960. February of 1960, the Little Rock Nine, this group of 9 black students who integrated the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. Fabulous story. February 29th, student sit-in organizers were expelled from Alabama State University. October of that year, Dr. King was arrested in Atlanta in a sit-in protest. November of that year, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges integrates New Orleans elementary schools all by herself. This tremendously brave little girl, a wonderful story. If you guys ever have a chance to read about Ruby Bridges, I would advise you. My school, every single year during Black History Month, some of our students do a presentation of the Ruby Bridges story, and it's just wonderful to see these young people really invested in that history. December of that year, the U.S. Supreme Court rules racial segregation in interstate bus terminals is unconstitutional. January of the following year, rioting white students forced suspension of the first black students to integrate the University of Georgia. So it was a very turbulent time in terms of race in the country when this book was being written. And that had an impact on Harper Lee and what she was writing in the book. And it had a huge impact in terms of how the book was received as well. So now let's move to 2015. We're all familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement. I did a series of talks about this a few months ago. I did them here as well as in Milwaukee. And so we're at a time now in America where we're doing something that I don't think we've ever really done before. We're actually getting together in multiracial groups and having conversations about race. We've never really done that. We've talked about doing it for a long time. But I think that because of all of these things that are related to the deaths of all of these black men and women over the past 3 years, beginning with the murder of Trayvon Martin, there's been this desire by people to get together and talk about these things. And I've been involved in a lot of those conversations in Milwaukee with several different groups. And so that's kind of the context that we're dealing with. I believe it's important for us to dig into this idea of racial frames. Why we see race differently. Depending on the group that you belong to, depending on your age, depending on where you were raised, depending on where you live, all of these different factors impact how you see race. The lenses that you see through are impacted by not only your history, but the history of the people that were your ancestors, even going back several hundred years perhaps. So what happens is we oftentimes have conversations about American history and we have these big arguments and disagreements because we're looking at it from a different frame of reference. And what we very rarely ever do is to take the time to turn the corner and look at it from someone else's perspective. And that's what we need to do. To really get a deep understanding of American history, we have to look at it from a frame of reference other than our own. And so if you do that, it gives you a much better understanding of American history. And it really, to me, I found that when people do this, it really makes it a much more comfortable conversation. And one of the things that I believe that we need to become comfortable with, and I think Brian Stevenson mentioned something of this nature too, we need to become comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. It's clear that that's what we have to do. We haven't really been willing to do that. You know, people don't like to be uncomfortable. We love to be comfortable. But at some point, if we're going to really get past these racial issues we have to have uncomfortable conversations and be comfortable having them. Do what Dr. King used to say, disagree without being disagreeable. Expect other people to have differences of opinion, but just accept that that's their frame of reference. That's what they're working with. You know, if you're making meatloaf And I could get 10 people in this room to make meatloaf, and you get 10 different meatloafs, right? I doubt if any two people would make meatloaf exactly the same, because your frame of reference is different. This is the way your mother made meatloaf. This is the way your grandmother made meatloaf. This is the way you changed those recipes and made the meatloaf yourself. So everybody has a different kind of meatloaf, different perspective, and we have to keep that in mind and not be afraid to accept other people's differences of opinion. So let's look at the reaction for the black community then and now. As I did research, I looked at what was written about the book back in 1960, 1961. I looked at journals in black journals, such as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, who reviews just tons and tons of books every year. I looked at Jet Magazine, I looked at Ebony Magazine, I looked at a variety of different sources, and what I found, which surprised me a little bit, was that they really didn't say much at all about this book. It wasn't something that was a big deal in the black community. Black people weren't really talking about the book at that time. Now, I have seen some people that were around at that time. Andrew Young, I saw an interview that he gave where he talked about how this was a transformative book, but he says he didn't realize that until years later. So at the time the book came out, because of all of the stuff that was going on fighting Jim Crow segregation, blacks were so concerned with that the book didn't really resonate with them at all. It wasn't a big deal. However, for whites, it was a transformative book. It was the first book that had really taken a deep look at race in the way that it did since Uncle Tom's Cabin. So it became hugely popular and remained so for many, many years, even up to including today. Atticus Finch in the book is this heroic figure. And I've heard lots of people talking about the book and talking about Atticus Finch and the power that he had over their lives to kind of transform the way they saw the world. And that's absolutely what happened with the book. That's what Harper Lee wanted the book to do. She wanted the character of Atticus, by what he did, and more importantly, what he said, to transform the way people looked at race. And she, I believe, did a wonderful job of that. And we'll talk about that in more detail shortly. So Atticus Finch, in the book, this is what he said about why he was defending Tom Robinson. He said, "There's been some talk around town to the effect that I shouldn't do much about defending this man. If I didn't, I couldn't hold up my head in town. I couldn't represent this county in the legislature. I couldn't even tell you or Jim not to do something again." And he was talking to Scout at the time. So he's basically saying that this is something that I have to do if I want to be able to hold my head up walking around this community. It's not something that I'm required to do by law. I could let someone else do it, but I feel compelled to do this. I feel it's my duty to defend this man. And so that was his perspective in the book. Talking about whether or not he could win the case, he said, this is a conversation took place between him and his children. "Atticus, are we going to win it?" He says, "No, honey." And Scout says, "Then why?" And he says, "Simply because we were licked 100 years before we started is no reason for us not to try to win." So he's talking about 100 years before this, when, there were very difficult times for any whites who wanted to support blacks in any way, shape, or form. And he said that it was impossible. We were licked in those efforts to help blacks. But he says that does not stop us from trying. He says, "This time we aren't fighting the Yankees, we're fighting our friends. But remember this, no matter how bitter things get, they're still our friends, and this is still our home." So he says, even after all of this is over, once the trial is over, these people that may say bad things about me, bad things about the family, they're still going to be people that we have relationships with. And so we have to understand that if we have bitterness towards them, that shouldn't stop us from being friends. We can have disagreements with people and still be friends, because he wants to maintain a sense of normalcy for his children after this trial is over. These were some things from his closing remarks, and as I reread it just this past week or so, I was fascinated by the closing remarks that he gave. It said something to me that it hadn't said to me when I read it before. because I was looking in it in more depth. And I want to really just share with you guys the importance of his closing remarks. And he's talking here about Mayella, and after she testifies, and the things that she said happened versus the things that her father said versus the things that the sheriff said. And this is what he says about her. He says, she has committed no crime. She has merely broken a rigid and time-honored code of our society. What did she do? She tempted a Negro. She was white and she tempted a Negro. She did something that in our society is unspeakable. She kissed a black man. And this is the mindset of America in the 1930s. Up until 1967, I believe there were 19 states, and it had been at one time 31 states, where it was absolutely, positively illegal for blacks and whites to marry one another. There's a case called Loving versus Virginia in 1967 that overturned all of those state statutes that said you couldn't marry a person of a different racial group. So at this particular time, not only was marriage out of the question, but any type of relationship, any thought of someone having intimate contact, especially a black man having intimate contact with a white woman, you were risking your life. You could either be killed, beaten, whatever, castrated in many cases, these men. So it was really, if you had that situation happen, you were risking your life. For a white woman to tempt a black man, she would be considered the lowest of the low in the white community. She would be castigated by the members of the community. They would call her all types of very nasty things. And so she knew that she had to get out of that situation and make it seem as if she was not the person who was trying to have a relationship with Tom, that it was all him, that he raped me. And this is something that happened very often when white women had relationships with black men. It happened very often during the Civil War. It happened during the days of enslavement. It happened over and over and over and over and again. It was a part of the fabric of America. We don't like to talk about it, but it was absolutely positively true. And if you were in that situation as a white woman, you had to say you were raped. Because even if you didn't, you would be treated like someone who would never want to live in that town again. So she accused him of rape. This is another few things he said. He said, the witnesses for the state have presented themselves to you, gentlemen, to this court in the cynical confidence that their testimony would not be doubted. Confident that you gentlemen would go along with them on the assumption, the evil assumption, that all Negroes lie, that all Negroes are basically immoral beings, that all Negro men are not to be trusted around our women. You know the truth, and the truth is this: some Negroes lie, some Negroes are immoral, some Negro men are not to be trusted around women, black or white. But this is a truth that applies to the human race and to no particular race of men. There is not a person in this courtroom who has never told a lie, who has never done an immoral thing. What he's telling the jury is that these white people that have come in this courtroom and put their hand on the Bible and sworn to tell the truth, they've lied. They've told blatant lies with the confidence that this all-white jury of 12 white men would disregard the fact that they were lying and would accept their testimony as the truth, because that's the way it was. Blacks were not allowed to serve on juries. Women weren't allowed to serve on juries at this time. So these people who came into courtrooms across the country testified, told lie after lie after lie. They felt a sense of confidence within themselves that it didn't matter, because they were going to take your word over the word of any black person who testified. And he's trying to get into the minds of the jury to let them know that that's not right. That's not the way it should be. He says there is one way in this country in which all men are created equal. That institution, gentlemen, is a court. Gentlemen, a court is no better than each man of you sitting before me on this jury. A court is only as sound as its jury, and a jury is only as sound as the men who make it up. I am confident that you gentlemen will review without passion the evidence you have heard, come to a decision, and restore this defendant to his family. In the name of God, do your duty. This is his final words to the jury. So he's trying to coax them into letting go of those emotions that you feel about this black man who you believe may or may not have raped this white woman. Let go of that racism that's inside of you and look at the facts of the case and ask yourself, does this make sense? Does it make sense that she would have bruises on the side of her face that obviously came from a left-handed person when Tom had no use of his left hand because it was injured in an accident at work? It was basically just a limb that he couldn't even lift up. So how could he possibly give her injuries that obviously came from a left-handed person? He talked about the contradictions between what the dad said he saw, what the daughter said she saw. And he's asking this jury to look at the evidence and do the right thing. Here's a conversation that Jim had with Reverend Sykes as the trial had come to its conclusion. Don't see how any jury could convict on what we heard, is what Jim says. And Reverend Sykes says, now don't be so confident, Mr. Jim. I ain't ever seen any jury decide in favor of a colored man over a white man. But Jim took exception to Reverend Sykes. Jim was just a kid. He didn't realize the reality of the world. You know how kids are? They believe that you should be fair. I hear this from my students all the time. That's not fair, Mr. Jackson. That's not fair. Children love being fair until they get to like middle school, and then it doesn't matter as much. But they believe in this sense of fairness. And so as Jim was watching this trial and listening to this testimony, Jim said that there's no way anybody in their right mind could hear this testimony and believe that Tom Robinson committed this crime. So in his mind, if they looked at the evidence and it was so obvious, there's no way they could convict this man. But Reverend Sykes knew from experience that this wasn't the case. After the verdict, we know the verdict. Tom was found guilty. 12 out of 12 voted guilt. Atticus said Jim bleakly. He turned in the doorway. What, son? How could they do it? How could they? And Atticus says, I don't know, but they did it. They've done it before, and they did it tonight, and they'll do it again. He's talking about the court system and the jury system and how it's rigged. And he knows it's rigged. He's an attorney. He knows very well that it's rigged against black people. And he's trying to let his son know, because his son believes in this sense of fairness and justice. He's trying to let his son know that in the real world we live in, son, that's not the way it really works. It should work that way, but when you look at it, in reality, it doesn't work that way. So he's trying to impart this very important lesson onto his children. There's a neighbor, Miss Marty, who was talking about the trial, and this is what she said. She said, we're the safest folks in the world. We're so rarely called on to be Christians, but when we are, we've got men like Atticus to go for us. And then Jim says, wish the rest of the county thought that. And she says, you'd be surprised how many of us do. And Jim gets very upset and says, who? Who in this town did one thing to help Tom Robinson? Just who? And she says, his colored friends for one thing, and people like us, people like Judge Taylor, people like Heck Tate. So this conversation is about, did anybody really care? Did anybody really do anything to help Tom? I mean, he believed, because he had heard his entire life about this idea of being fair, and yet he looked and he said, how could these people in town not look at this and say, we should help Tom? Tom didn't do this. How could they have the exact opposite view? And so this conversation goes back and forth about that. And this is a learning process for Jim. He's learning how the real world works. You know, one of the things that we as adults do, and all of you have done this, I'm telling you, you've all done it, and don't deny it. You've lied to children before. I mean, that's what we do. We lie to children. We lie to them about Santa Claus. I can still remember very vividly when I discovered there wasn't a Santa. I wasn't really that upset when I found out. But my brother and I were just playing hide and seek in the house, and I hid in my mother's closet. And as I'm going through the closet, I'm like falling over all of this stuff. I'm like, man, there's a bicycle in here. Oh, there's train tracks and a little train set. And I'm finding all this stuff. I'm like, Mom, it's actually Santa. So all of those lies I've been told all those years just kind of fell apart, but I was very happy. Because I was like, Santa is closer than I thought. So we lie to our children, and Jim is beginning to realize this now, that people have been lying to him his entire life. So what messages come from the book? Atticus sends very clear messages to his children through the process of this trial. This is some advice that he gave Jim. He says, there's something in our world that makes men lose their heads. They couldn't be fair if they tried. In our courts, when it's a white man's word against a black man's, the white man always wins. They're ugly, but those are the facts of life. As you grow older, you'll see white men cheat black men every day of your life. But let me tell you something, and don't forget it. Whenever a white man does that to a black man, no matter who he is, how rich he is, or how fine a family he comes from, that white man is trash. There's nothing more sickening to me than a low-grade white man who'll take advantage of a Negro's ignorance. Don't fool yourselves. It's all adding up. And one of these days, we're going to pay the bill for it. I hope it's not in your children's time. He's saying that all of these bad things that have been done to blacks, it's going to catch up with whites eventually. And he's hoping that it doesn't catch up in such a way that his children's children feel the ill effects from it. The message that he's sending to both of his children with this is he's saying, listen, people are well aware that they've been unfair to blacks. They're well aware that they've discriminated, that they've been horrible to blacks throughout American history. It's not as if it's a secret to them. When you do people wrong, you know you're doing someone wrong. But eventually, it doesn't work anymore. That was part of what the Civil Rights Movement was about, was making those wrongs become rights. Saying, listen, we know you guys have kept us from voting. We want to vote. And we're not going to stand by and not allow the system that's in place to prevent us from voting. We're going to find a way to get rights to vote. We're going to find a way to get rid of those silly signs that say whites only, coloreds only. We will fight to end that system. This is what he's warning his children about. It's almost like he's previewing the coming decades of the Civil Rights Movement, when the tables will turn and all of those things that accrue to benefit whites, they would lose those powers. They would lose the ability to totally, completely control the black community. And he was hoping that when that time came, that his children and their children wouldn't suffer. After Tom died, and we read in the book, and it's not written in such a way that Scout describes what happens. Remember, they hear the story kind of secondhand, that he was in this jail and he tried to escape and he ran to this fence and he climbed over the fence with one arm and they shot him in the back and they shot him 17 times and killed him. And so, as we're reading that, this is one of the things that was said. Atticus is saying, he said, we had such a good chance. He's talking about a possible appeal. He says, I told him what I thought, but I couldn't in truth say that we had more than a good chance. I guess Tom was tired of white men's chances and preferred to take his own. So he's basically saying, listen, Tom was not an idiot. Tom was not going to trust the system in the appeal any more than he trusted it in the original trial. He knew that no appeals would work, and so he tried to escape, to gain that freedom the only way he felt he could. Another character, Dolphus Raymond, said this. He said, cry about the simple hell people give other people without even thinking. Cry about the hell white people give colored folks without even stopping to think that they're people too. And this is a theme that goes on and on throughout the book. These are things that are being said by these characters that haven't been said in American novels written by white people. They have been said in novels written by blacks for decades. But there were not popular novels where white people were saying these types of things. And that's what made this book different than other books. The words that Harper Lee wrote into the mouths of those characters were words that white America had not spoken out loud in large groups. And so it really, really fascinated people to hear those things because it was something that was new for them. You guys have all heard this saying, sticks and stones may break my bones.
But names will never hurt me.
I don't know why people tell that lie to children. I don't know why that saying is so well known, because it's a lie. Words hurt. They have tremendous amounts of power. The power of racial epithets. We as a society, we have been almost, I would have to say, fanatics about racial epithets. We have found very ugly words to describe every group of people that's ever lived in this country. And we continue to do it. And we don't seem to have a problem with it. We have a football team called the Redskins. Are you kidding me? The Redskins. And some people are offended by it and other people say, oh, there's nothing wrong with it. That's nonsense. We use racial epithets. Redskins to most Native Americans is an epithet. They don't see it as something that's okay. And we hear people say this, and it drives me crazy when I hear people say this. You know, people are a little bit too politically correct nowadays. I want to still be a racist and call people what I used to call them. That's what you're saying to me when you say that. When I hear someone say that people are too politically correct, you're saying there's a hidden message that's saying to me, I want to call you a nigger to your face, but I know I really can't. That's the message that you're sending. Because political correctness is simply people who have been done badly, being called these names, saying, stop calling me that. I don't like it, I never have, I never will, and if you say it again, I may punch you in the mouth. That's the message, that's what's happening. But people want to say, oh, people are too sensitive. Nonsense. We should be sensitive when people call us things that we don't like. But we are living in a society now where you have to kind of be very careful on either side. And I think that that's very sad, considering where we've come from. This is one of the things that really jumped out to me when I read the book. And I guarantee you that most of you, when you read the book, you read this part and you just kept going. It was just, just a few words. It didn't stand out to you when you read it. It stood out to me immediately when I read it. These words, Scout was discussing Tom, and she says, Tom was a black velvet Negro. Not shiny, but soft black velvet. The whites of his eyes shone in his face, and when he spoke, we saw flashes of his teeth. If he had been whole, he would have been a fine specimen of a man. And then there's another line that says, well, Dill, after all, he's just a Negro. How demeaning are those words when you read them in this context? When you read the book, you read them, you just kept going. It didn't, you didn't stop to contemplate those words. I did. I'm like, I definitely have to use that in the presentation. Because it literally made me stop in my tracks at that point in the book. Because to me, that was a very important part of something that's going on in the book that really makes the book not something that black people really, really love. And there's some other things we'll talk about. But that stops a black person in their tracks when they read that. That makes them pause and think and consider, what the heck are they saying? The average white person who reads it, they gloss over it and keep going because of our racial lenses. Gilmer is cross-examining Tom Robinson, and as he's doing so, he called him boy 7 different times. Atticus even refers to Tom as a boy several times throughout the book. Now I want to share a story with you guys related to this word boy, because it's an epithet as well. I used to be an electrician before I became a teacher. I worked at a chemical company, and we were having a meeting, the maintenance staff, electricians and mechanics. We were having a meeting with basically the boss of the company, the president of the company. And he had come up with this initiative to raise morale in the company. And I was discussing it with some of my coworkers before we got to the meeting. I said, I don't think that's a very good idea. I don't think that's going to do much to raise, people's like, oh wow, I feel really good now. This is making me feel great. I didn't think it was going to work. So I was very honest about it. And in the meeting I said, I don't really think that's going to work. And this man got so angry with me. And this is what he said. Immediately after I said those words, he turned to me, his face was redder than your sweater, and he said, "Well, that's how it's gonna be, boy." And I stopped. And I said, "What did you say?" And he said, "That's how it's gonna be, boy." I'm not a violent person. I've never been a violent person. But every inch of me wanted to wrap my hands around his neck and choke the life out of him. But I didn't. People grabbed me before I could, even if I wanted to, they grabbed me. But I did get my hand out far enough to point it in his face and say, "If you ever call me boy again, you'll regret it." And so later, after the meeting was over, I went and called the human resources director. She was out of town. I reached her on her cell phone, told her what happened, and she says, "Well, I'll investigate it when I'm back." So the following day, she came back and did a so-called investigation. But that day, this was 2.5 hours before the end of my workday. After that happened, I was so emotional inside. I told my supervisor, I have to go. I can't stay here the rest of the day. I have to go. And I went straight to my wife's job. And I went in and I told her I need to see my wife. And she came out, she thought there was some tragic event, some medical emergency, something of that nature. And I was trying to tell her what happened. And something happened to me that had never happened before. I couldn't get the words out of my mouth. I started crying like a baby. That's how much those words hurt me inside. I became so emotional that I couldn't even get this out and tell my wife how hurt I was. And the hurt wasn't just from the word that he used. The hurt also came from the fact that I was helpless to do anything about it. There was nothing I could do. I knew what I wanted to do. I know if I was certain other people, I probably would have been taken out in handcuffs. But I had to think about my family and my future and things, so I couldn't do what the natural inclination may have been to choke this man. And so when I went back to work the following day, talked to human resources director, and she talked to him. She talked to some people that were there, finding out what happened. And she says, "Well, Reggie, he wants to apologize for what he said." I said, "I don't want an apology from him." She says, "Well, he doesn't necessarily want to give it face. He wants to write you a letter and apologize." I said, "He can write a letter. I'll never read it." I said, "His apology will mean nothing to me because he said what he meant and he meant what he said." I said, "So don't tell that man I don't need an apology from him. It will have no impact on me whatsoever. I've always heard this saying that you should forgive and forget. I definitely can't forget because it's almost as if it happened yesterday. That's how clear it is in my mind. And I cannot force myself to forgive him for what he did. I can forgive people who make mistakes. This is a mistake. I'm driving down the street and where I'm trying to go is to the right and I turn to the left. That's a mistake. When you say what he said to me, that was not a mistake. He meant to say that. He wanted to say those words. He couldn't wait to get those words out of his mouth. So I can't accept an apology for something that wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. He intended to hurt me with those words. And as you guys can see, my reaction even now tells you that that's still inside of me. It's never going to go away. If I live to be 117 years old, and don't get Alzheimer's, it'll be fresh in my mind. That's how powerful words can be. The word nigger is used 48 times in the book. How many of you guys knew that? By a show of hands. 48 separate times. What I actually did is I actually made slides with each one of the times it's used, but I said, no, that's too much. I'm not going to go through every one of those 48 times. But it's used 48 different times in the book. So imagine, here you are, a young black person in high school, anywhere in the country. And required reading is To Kill a Mockingbird. And so you may be in class with some white classmates and there's a handful of blacks or whatever, and you're reading the book, and they like to read stuff out loud in class. And here you are, this young black student, and you're hearing one of your white classmates read and they say nigger, and then they read nigger again, and then they read nigger, nigger, and it just never seems to stop. That's going to resonate with you. As a black person, you're going to say, can I really say that I like this book? When I see this ugly word used over and over and over, regardless of the context, the word is there. You can't get rid of it. It's there. Most people don't notice it. I had a person last night who wrote on their index card that they had read the book and they never noticed the word. They said they didn't notice it. And that's because of the lenses that we have that I've talked about. There are things that stand out to some people and don't stand out to other people. There are things that have an impact on some people and have a completely different impact on other people. This word being used 48 times has an impact when blacks read it. Variations of nigger lover are used 11 different times in the book. Now this is a term that's used to describe Tom and his family by the white community. Yeah, Atticus, not Tom. Thank you for that correction. So Atticus and his family are called nigger lovers over and over, 11 different times they refer to them as this. Now there is nothing in the Deep South at this time that a white person could be called that's lower than that. Nothing. Nothing, because you, by being a nigger lover, you are fighting against the system that maintains white supremacy. You're fighting against that system that has been put in place to maintain supremacy of whites over blacks. You're trying to break down the barriers by doing what you're doing, Atticus. And so words have true impact. There's some other controversies related to the book. This idea of Atticus Finch as a great white hope. That's the overwhelming theme of the book. All of the conversations that I've heard in recent weeks about the book, in recent months even about the book. I've watched a lot of stuff, people talking about it, reading things that people are writing, and there's this overwhelming idea that, this Atticus is this wonderful person. He comes into this ugly situation and he helps this poor black man, Tom. And that's the overwhelming thing. That's what white people see when they read the book. That's what people have told me. That, man, this is such a heroic guy. I haven't heard a single black person say that though. They're like, he tried to help. But they don't look at him as, man, this is not a heroic guy. Because they realize that even though he tried to help Tom, that at that particular time in American history, it didn't make a difference. And if you look back on the history, the real history of that time frame, there really weren't whites who were willing to do this. That kind of changed a little bit. There's a case called the Scottsboro Boys. You guys ever heard of this case? These young black men who were riding the rails, trying to find work, going from county to county, city to city, looking for work. They were on this train in Alabama, and some white women got on the train, some young white women. Some white men noticed, and they stopped the train, and the sheriff came, and they accused these black men, these boys, mostly were boys, of raping these two white women. Now the white women said, no, they didn't rape us, they didn't do anything to us, we were just riding the train with them. But it didn't matter. These young men went through a series of trials where some of them were given the death penalty, some of them were given life in prison, some of them were given shorter sentences, and they had to fight these cases. And there was a debate over who would defend these young men. The NAACP wanted to defend these young men, but they had competition from a white organization called the Socialist Workers Party, and they debated back and forth who would be in charge of defending these young men. And so they kind of split it up, and the NAACP did some, the Socialist Workers Party did some. So that was really one of the first times in American history where whites were actually fighting to defend blacks accused of this ugly crime. And so that was kind of a transition in the way the legal system worked in America. For the most part, whites weren't interested in defending blacks. How many of you guys knew this? And I didn't know this until Brian Stevenson said this on Saturday. In the state of Alabama today, there is no such thing as the right to have an attorney. There is no public defender system in the state of Alabama. If you're accused of a crime and you don't have money, you're stuck. Here in the state of Wisconsin, public defender system. They have income limits where if you make more than this amount of money, you can't get a public defender. Anybody want to guess what the limit is? $3,000 a year. If you make more than $3,000 a year, you're not, by the law, required to get a public defender. Imagine that. Black characters as stereotypes, black characters lacking courage. One of the things that blacks have criticized about the book is that throughout the book, none of the black characters do anything courageous. They're just these idle people standing by watching this horrible thing happen to Tom. Even when the mob was coming to attack Tom, there's no black person that stood up and said, oh, well, hold on, we're not gonna let this happen. When in the real world, when things like that happen, blacks are like, man, listen, we're not gonna just let y'all break it in this jail and take this brother out of here. They would stop a lot of mob attacks on jails. A lot of black men, women, and children who would have been lynched otherwise were saved by the courage of black people. But this book never shows you that courageous side of blacks fighting. Blacks were always determined to maintain their rights, their dignity. They always fought. They fought against slavery. It wasn't just abolitionists. You know who the real abolitionists were? Black folks who were saying, we don't want to be slaves no more. Free blacks who had either gained their freedom or had been free for generations, who said, we want to free the rest of our brethren in this country. Those were the abolitionists. The abolitionists that we read about came later. They were Johnny-come-latelys in the eyes of these blacks. They're like, man, we've been saying this for the last 100 years. Y'all just figured it out? But the book never kind of describes that dynamic within the black community. Black characters as stereotypes. We'll talk about that. People have attempted to boycott the book. They've written letters to schools and said, I'm not going to allow my child to read this book. People have tried to ban the book. There's a case in 1996, Nova Scotia in Canada, where the black residents of the town said, this book should not be taught in the schools. Our children should not have to read a book where they see the word nigger 48 times. They should not have to read a book that stereotypes black people, shows black people as uncourageous people. It doesn't make them feel good about themselves. And so they attempted to get the book banned. It didn't work, of course. They continued to teach the book. But what these people said in the end, because they didn't have a lot of confidence that they would win, but this is what they said. They said, even if we lose this is what we want you to do. We want you to teach the book in context, so that people have a better understanding of how the book really worked. If you do that, we're okay with our children reading it. That's what they requested, but that didn't happen. Stereotypes of blacks that are found in the book. There were two that I'm going to share with you guys that you probably didn't notice. But as I share this with you now, you will notice, because it's a very familiar stereotype. This brute stereotype of black men being brutes, being savage, animalistic criminals, fiends, sociopaths, antisocial menaces, predators who target helpless victims, especially white women. That's Tom Robinson. That's Tom Robinson in the book. This stereotype of the black rapist. That's a stereotype that's there that you probably, you read it, but you didn't really catch on that that's a stereotypical image of black men. You probably didn't catch on that Calpurnia, their cook, was this contented, happy, hearty, loyal servant. Remember how loyal she was to the family? She was always there. Did she ever talk about her own family? Did she ever mention her children? Did she ever talk about the love that she had for her family and children? No, she didn't. Now, we don't know if she was obese. I don't remember them describing her in that way, but they described her as coarse. Very early in the book, I can remember Scout being mad at Calpurnia and saying she was a tyrant. This is part of the stereotype. Treated her own family with disdain, desexualized, no black friends. The white family was her entire world. That's Calpurnia. That's Calpurnia. If you go back and read the book, you will see that that's an exact description of this character that Harper Lee wrote, the stereotypical black mammy. And it was very clear to me when I read it, because these are things that resonate with me. Present day relevance. So, how is this book important? I'll tell you how the book is important. The book is important because, number one, over 60 million copies have been printed and read. This book has been read by people in dozens of countries outside the United States, written into other languages. It's a very important book. It's a classic American novel. It's required reading in school systems all over the country. It's not a book that's going to go away. But we as a society are afraid to talk about the book through a different lens. We just read it as just another great American novel. We don't read it and analyze the racial dynamics of it because we as a society are afraid to do that. We're afraid to talk about those things. And so my advice with the book, as we move forward, I would advise all of us who've read the book, who plan to read the book, who plan to talk to someone about the book, try to step back and look at it through a different racial frame. And ask yourself, why, when you read the book, you didn't notice that the word nigger was in there 48 times? Ask yourself, why seeing that word as you read it didn't really bother you all that much? Ask yourself why these black characters are pushed to the side as just these victims who can't help themselves, and the heroes of the book are all white people. Ask yourselves those questions, because those are the questions really that help you understand the power of the book. Because this, to me, is the power of the book. If you use it in the right way, if you teach it in the right way, if you analyze it in the right way, this is the overwhelming power of the book. The messages that Atticus sends to his children, to those people in the courtroom, are some of the most powerful messages ever heard in an American book. This man is speaking the words that black people have been saying since they got here. And it's not too many white men that have spoken those words. Not too many white men have had the courage to speak those words. So it's Atticus, but it's really Harper Lee saying these words. Harper Lee is saying, listen, this is 1960. We're still afraid to deal with race. We're still afraid to talk about it. And she wanted the book to resonate with people that read it. She wanted people to get the messages that Atticus was sending about how unfair the system was to blacks, about how it was rigged, about how they had no chance, and how Tom was innocent, but it didn't matter. She was saying to America, we have been evil towards black people. We need to wake up to this. Think about the things that were happening as she was writing this book. She was trying to awaken the mindset of people in America, especially whites. The book was written for a white audience. It was written to send a clear message to white America that, look, we've been lying to ourselves for too long. We've been denying that blacks have been treated this horrible way for too long. We have embarrassed ourselves as a nation, talking about freedom and justice and liberty and the Declaration of Independence and all men are created equal. We've been lying to ourselves. If you guys go back and carefully read the U.S. Constitution, you will not find the word slave or the word slavery in the U.S. Constitution until the 13th Amendment, the amendment that officially ended slavery and involuntary servitude. Why were those words not in the U.S. Constitution? Because the Founding Fathers did not want to look like hypocrites. They did not want to found a nation built on democracy and freedom and justice for all. At the same time, they treated the black citizens not as second-class citizens, but not even as humans. They treated them like cattle. They sold them, they beat them, they raped them, they killed them, they split up their families, they disallowed them to learn their native languages, They disallowed them to worship in the way they wanted to worship. They took all of these human things away from an entire group of human beings. And at the same time they were doing that, they were standing up, waving this flag, saying, look how wonderful we are. And they knew that the world would look at them as hypocrites. And so they tried to disguise, when they were talking about the slaves, they described them as other persons. Guess what happened though? Civil War started. These 11 states broke away and formed the Confederate States of America. They drew up a constitution also. Almost word for word the same as the U.S. Constitution. The big difference, when they were talking about the slaves, they said slave. When they were talking about slavery, they said slavery. They were honest. As much as I despise those people, they were honest. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal. He owned, during the course of his life, over 200 black people. We don't learn that in history class. We learn that Abraham Lincoln is this heroic figure, this person to be admired, because he freed the slaves. He didn't free the slaves. The fact that 200,000 black men joined the Union Army and Navy turned the tide of the Civil War and ended up leading to the North winning the war. Had that not happened, we'd be celebrating Jefferson Davis as a former president of the United States of America. We'd all be living in Alabama instead of Wisconsin. This is the reality of it. And so when we look at this book, when we look at those messages that Harper Lee is sending, what I got from it, from the perspective of the way I see the world and the perspective of the research I did on it and how other people looked at it, it's very clear to us that the book has power beyond what we give it. If we use it correctly, if we use it as a tool to open up dialogue about these things. That's what Harper Lee was attempting to do. Harper Lee was like saying, we need to start talking about this stuff openly and honestly. Stop being afraid of it. It's right in front of us. We're pretending that it's not. It's right there. We know that Jim Crow laws are not right. We know it. We know that black people shouldn't have to go to the back of a restaurant to get their food, that they shouldn't have to drink out of a separate water fountain, that they should have the same right to vote as anyone else. America knew it, just didn't want to admit it. There's a line that I remember, I believe it was a comedian said this. I know you did it, just admit it. I know you did it, just admit it. Be honest, and then you can move past it. My mother used to say this to me when I was a child. I was a very nice child. I was a good child, believe me. My mother tells me this all the time. She says, you were the easiest child in the world to raise. She said, you were like a little angel. But of course, little angels get into stuff that they shouldn't occasionally. But one of the things that I realized was my mother, and most of these messages were to my brother, who was not the little angel. This message was very clear. I heard this over and over again. It's okay to make a mistake. Just don't lie about it. Because that makes it worse. You guys probably told your children that. Now listen, Bobby, come on. I know you did it. Just admit it, Lying about it makes it worse. We've all said this as parents. We've heard people say this. This is what we need to do as a nation. We know we did it. Just admit it. Talk about it. And this book will allow us to do it. If we take those messages that Atticus was sending us through his words and use them in that way, this book can be the most powerful book ever written in American history, if we use it that way. If we just read it as just a classic American novel, it's a wonderful story, and just ignore all of those things, we don't get the true value of the book. We don't get what Harper Lee wanted us to get from the book. So thank you guys so much. I would love if you would pass up questions, and I will do my best to answer those questions. And if I could get my 2 or 3 pens back, that would be. So please pass the questions up. Thank you all so much.
Reggie, while you're collecting those, could I just...
Sure. So any questions, just please pass them
What
up.
if you didn't write it so you to read it? I thought I would just be able to say the question.
Oh, I'm a teacher. I can read any handwriting. It's a skill I've developed over the years.
I challenge you.
Listen, if I can read my handwriting, I can read anyone's handwriting. I got to tell you guys a story about my handwriting. As a little child growing up in Mississippi, I was born left-handed. It was a superstition against being left-handed that was very prevalent. And when I went to school, when I first started school and I was writing with my left hand, my teacher would smack me on the hand with a ruler and make me switch to my right hand. When I went home, my grandmother would smack me and make me write with my right hand. And I developed a lifelong hatred of writing. I cannot stand writing. And I take it out on myself and I write, horribly. But I can read it because I'm used to it. But if I can read my sloppy handwriting, believe me, there's no barrier to me reading any of this. So thank you guys for the questions. Nick wants to share something with you.
Just so that people know, as I said in the beginning, this is part of the Big Read program that is going all month long in Kenosha and Racine. We still have about 10 or 15 of these books, To Kill a Mockingbird books, over at the reference desk if you don't have one, and if you would like to read the book while it's still going on this month. We also have a few in Spanish, actually. I just want to show, this is the list, and it's an incomplete list of programs that we have coming up for this. So it's in chronological order. We are, let's see, we're here. So all this other stuff is to come, and these lists are in the books also, but they're also available online. The one that I will point out, there's lots of justice themes, lots of ones talking about race and the justice system right now, so a lot of things that harmonize with this one. I do want to point out one that we'll be doing, which is not on this sheet. October 24th, there's a music and poetry series called Bonk that'll be held at the Riverbend Nature Center. We'll have 3 performances, a music performance and 2 poets. All of the acts that night are internationally known in their field. It's going to be a fantastic event at one of the greatest places in Racine, Riverbend Nature Center. So if you're interested in getting more information about that, let me know. The 2 poets that are coming, one's named Lainey Brown from Arizona, and the other is named Affa Michael Weaver from Boston. He is one of the most important poets in America today, and certainly one of the most important black elders of contemporary literature alive right now. So if you're interested in more information about that, please talk to me before you leave.
Nick, are all of those based on To Kill a Mockingbird? They're not on different books?
All of these are surrounded on themes of justice or race or To Kill a Mockingbird, something like that. It's all supposed to tie in somehow, but it might be just loosely about, a discussion on justice.
But you're not on another book. That isn't for different books.
No, yes, it's all
Okay.
about the same book.
All right.
And that really quick. The books and the brochures are in the books. They're all right over by the reference desk. That's the only place where they are tonight. Yes, sir?
Will the library remind us about this or send out a message like Jessica does usually?
Talk to me before you leave and I can make sure that happens for you. Thank you.
Okay, I have to check something in order to answer one of these questions.
Ooh.
Actually, 2 people asked the same question, and so I'm going to do some quick Googling, as my students like to do, instead of picking up an encyclopedia like I used to do. They like an encyclopedia. What's that? Is that like Wikipedia? I'm like, yeah, it's like Wikipedia for smart people. So,
What grade do you teach?
6th and 8th grade special ed students teach math primarily. All right. Okay, so I believe. All right. Okay. All right. So let me go through the questions. The first one says, I believe Harper Lee is still alive, but in poor health. I believe she had a stroke. She is still alive. Wow. And I believe she had a series of strokes over a period of about 2 years.
That's what the fuss was about publishing Watchmen.
Right.
People said she wouldn't really want to do it, and the lawyer said, oh, and could she really tell?
Yeah, it's really kind of sad. But yeah, she's still with us. Are we still making sure that people of color cannot vote by insisting on photo ID? I don't know if you guys heard this story. Alabama, the great state of Alabama. They recently passed a voter ID law, right? So they require anyone to vote has to have a state-issued identification card. Right after this law became effective, they decided in those counties that 75% of the blacks had voted for President Obama to close every Department of Motor Vehicles office in those counties. Let me say that again. In every county in Alabama where black people, 75% of blacks across the nation, he received like 97% of the black vote. Any county where he received 75% of the vote, they closed the DMVs in those places, preventing people from having access to get identification cards. It smacks of Jim Crow times. I mean, for someone to even have the audacity in 2015 to do something like that, thinking that, oh, no one will notice, no one will be upset.
Is the NAACP or the ACLU, are they filing suit? Because I cannot believe this will stand.
Well, I read...
You can tell them they can't do it.
Well, see, this is the thing about it. It's no different than Wisconsin. Legislatures pass laws, right? If you don't like the laws, you can challenge the laws in court, but it requires time, it requires money, it requires expertise, it requires effort, and you don't just overturn laws that have been passed by a legislature very easily. Now, obviously, I'm sure there are lots of groups that are working on challenging that law in Alabama, but that doesn't mean it's going to change overnight, even if it does change. There's a possibility it may not. We don't know. So all of these states that have adopted voter ID laws have done this specifically because they said, well, we're trying to prevent fraud.
Right.
Are you kidding me? Fraud? Wasn't it fraudulent to prevent black people from voting for 200 years? That wasn't fraudulent? I mean, give me a break, people, please. Klan resurgence. Was the law against the Klan abolished? No, it's still on the books. It's still a federal law. But it was just ignored. They just ignored it. Comment. I checked Wikipedia about a week ago and they indicated Harper Lee is still alive. And she is?
Yeah.
Is Mark Twain's use of N-word the same? I suppose so. Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, there are so many novels that have been written that are celebrated American novels where that word is used just over and over and over again. And for the most part, you know, black people don't want to read those books. It may be a great book. This is a great book, but why would I want to read a book that I got to look at that word over and over and over again? So, from the perspective of blacks, I think that people are becoming more attuned to the fact that there are issues with the book and saying that, you know, we need to do something different. If we do read the books, we need to read it differently. We need to teach it differently. So I think that the fact that those words are used by Mark Twain and numerous other authors, I think that we're having a conversation, an honest conversation about that now for the first time. There have been, you know, attempts for years to ban books that had this word in it, and it had never been successful. And so I think we've transitioned to a place now where we're saying, okay, we don't want to ban the book, but we want to have a different conversation about the book. And I think that's a very important part of what's coming out of this book now. What offends you about what Scout said about Tom, Black Velvet? Wow. Let's go back to that. Let's go back to that and just let's talk about that. Oh, moving too fast. Tom was a black velvet Negro. Not shiny, but soft black velvet. You guys know what velvet is?
Isn't that one of the, I understand that black people's complexions are described with different characteristics.
Right.
And when I read it, I assumed that was one of the descriptor characteristics. High Yeller and some others.
Right. So when I read this and it said black velvet was a black velvet Negro. Black velvet, I've seen people with black velvet coats and jackets and things. They're always the blackest of the black.
The black is what?
The blackest of the black. You can't get any blacker. I've never seen like a light black velvet jacket before. It's always very, very dark. Very shiny. And this is some of the things that people used to say, black people. My wife tells me this all the time. People want to touch your skin. White people, can I touch your skin? Can I touch your hair? Can I feel with your hair? I mean, to me, to talk about a human being in those terms as looking like velvet is just, I don't understand how. I don't understand how we can describe someone as black velvet, because listen, you guys look at my skin. Is my skin the color black?
No.
I mean, realistically, is it?
No.
The black people in the room, look at their skin. Is any of their skin really black?
No.
Look at the white people in the room. Is anyone's skin really white?
No.
I mean, it's just a term we use, right? It's not an accurate term. Blacks have all different types of complexions, but when blacks are described as this blacker than black, when you look at the word black, Malcolm X talked about this, and he says when he was in prison and he began to read and he went through the dictionary from A to Z, he started to notice a pattern. Everything related to black had a negative connotation. Everything related to white had a positive connotation. So when we hear black velvet, there's a negative connotation to that. Think about some of the terms that we use quite often. Illegal market is called the black market. Think of some terms about white. They're almost always positive. And so there's a way that words can send you a clear message. Even though it doesn't sound negative, it has a connotation of negativity to it. It's kind of tricky, kind of hard to understand the dynamic, but if you paid attention, and black people, I believe, have paid way more attention to this than whites, because it doesn't really impact white people. I mean, it's something that impacts us to be called, charcoal, and I hear students teasing each other, man, you so black. And so that's very negative. Yeah, you were going to say something.
What I wanted to say is that my mom made us all, she had 6 kids, and she made us all very aware of the power of language. And I've heard other black people say the same thing about getting to know what you're talking about and being explicit. Because she always said that whites will play tricks on you by throwing words out that you start to believe and want to use, but you have to be very careful about how you take these words and reuse them and scout. And when I look at that, oftentimes what we learn as kids, she heard that from an adult to pass that on. So that's the one thing I want to bring out. And other things similar to that, blacks is black as a cast iron skillet. Now, I know people who have said that, and most of them, are using that language that has been passed on. And then the other one that is highly offensive is blue black. Oh, he was a blue black Negro. And I'm like, you sit up all night trying to figure out those kind of terms, or what's going on?
And see, a lot of these terms, like the ones you mentioned, are really not part of the common conversation that people have. Many people in this room probably never heard any of those before. And so you read these different words, and they, they're just words. They don't really have meaning. This is the issue. And I tell people this all the time. Black, white, it's not the wrong calling somebody black or calling somebody white. Where it becomes problematic is when you give more value to one over the other. That's the issue. It's not an issue saying black people and white people. I mean, it's just a descriptor. It's not an accurate descriptor, but we all kind of understand what it means. But when we look at American history, and one of the things I talked about in my Do Black Lives Matter series, I talked about the evaluation of groups based on how they look. We give a different level of value to whites than we give to blacks throughout American history. We still do to this day. Yes, ma'am.
It makes me think of when I was little, we had black and white TV, and you always saw the good guys riding off in a white hat, and the bad guys, I don't know if they even had a hat, but it just made me always feel uncomfortable when I heard that. Because you knew the opposite was not a good thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And thank you. That's a great example. Another, and I'll get right to you. Another classic example of how this works is that if you look back at movies from the 30s and 40s and even 50s where whites were playing black characters, and they were in blackface, they were always very shiny black, tar black. Even though you can't find more than a handful of black people in the United States whose skin is actually that dark. But that's the stereotype, that even if you were like, you guys ever heard of the paper bag test before?
Yes.
If you're black, you've heard of it. If you're white, you probably never heard of it. So there's this colorism within the black community where, depending on the shade of your skin color as a black person, you're either acceptable or you're less acceptable. So they used to have what they call a paper bag test. So if your skin was the shade of a paper bag or lighter, then you were okay. If it was darker, then no, you're not so good. And so there's this connotation with color that really has a huge impact on how we, it's just words, but those words have impact. I'll get to you in just a second.
I was just going to comment that the shining whites of the eyes and the flashing teeth were what was really cringeworthy to me in that description.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that's part of the stereotype of the big buck eyes and smiling. If you guys look back, I want you guys to go to this place. I want you guys to go on the internet and go to the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. It's at Fair State University in Michigan. We had an exhibit from that museum that came and traveled to Milwaukee and spent about 3 months in our facility when it was still open. But if you go there and you look at these, the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, or just type in Jim Crow Museum and you'll get right there, and you'll see these images of pictures of little, all kinds of different artifacts that people are still selling today. You can go on eBay and buy these things for next to nothing. But you'll see how blacks are portrayed as super duper dark skin, big, thick, gigantic black red lips. Their lips are humongous. Their eyes are 3 times the size of normal people's eyes. And this is a stereotype that still haunts us, still sticks with us to this day. And so those things are very important. Let me continue. You were going to say something, sir.
Yeah, I heard the phrase the paper bag test as something that soldiers in the Pacific in World War II would use to decide whether or not they would date somebody.
Wow, that one I've never heard.
That's the context that I was told. I don't know if the speaker was in fact knowledgeable.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things related to.
But I've heard of it also. I may interject that if I were going to bring someone home to meet my folks, or if I was going to apply to be a candidate in a ball of some sort, cotillion or whatever. You better not even think about it unless you could pass that paper bag test.
Yeah. There's and I don't know if it's available. I don't think the entire thing is available online, but I know parts of it are. There's a documentary called Dark Girls. Dark Girls. You guys should check it out. It talks about this issue of colorism. And I believe there's enough of it on YouTube and other places for you to kind of get an idea of how prevalent this issue is. Let me continue. Ruby Bridges, someone writes Ruby Bridges. This little girl, I'm telling you, it's a fascinating story of the power of not giving up. This little girl wanted to go to whatever school she wanted to go to. She was denied entrance into the school because it was a segregated school, and she said, I'm going to get into that school. I'm going to fight to get in that school, and nobody's going to get in my way and stop me. And she fought through this and fought through this, and she was threatened. All kinds of crazy things happened to her, but she did it. She did it. She desegregated the schools in New Orleans. This little, powerful little girl.
Surrounded by federal marshals.
Yeah.
And all these white people screaming epithets at her.
Yeah, absolutely. Imagine this little
six-year-old
girl. What harm could she possibly do by going to school? But just to tell you how powerful this idea of segregated schools was, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, was supposed to make these sweeping changes and force the schools to desegregate. People fought against it. States fought against it. They didn't accept it. The state of Virginia closed all of its public schools for 4 years. This is what they did. They closed all of the public schools. They took that public school money. They opened up private academies for white children to attend. Black families couldn't use this money. So you took private school or public school money and you gave it to private schools. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Wow. How little things have changed. And that's how private schools became so popular around the country. Private schools used to simply be for wealthy people only. Regular, average, middle class, and poor people, you couldn't get into one of those because you never had the money. But that transformed the idea of how private schools would work forever. Okay, Virtue Museum, Dr. James Cameron Legacy Foundation. Do you foresee opening the doors again? We're very hopeful. We have been working with a real estate developer who has proposed a plan to have an initiative on the block where the museum used to be to redevelop that entire block. It houses right now the old Black Holocaust Museum building, Garfield Elementary School, the National Urban League office is there, and there's an old restaurant that's been closed for who knows how many years. And so she made a proposal to redevelop that entire block. It's going through the process of all of these different agencies looking at it, determining whether or not they can find the money, and it's a very, very complicated plan. And so it's going through the motions. We're hopeful that by the end of the year we'll hear something positive, but you never know. Do you present at high schools? I have a difficult time presenting at high schools because I'm at school myself, teaching. So it's very difficult for me to get away. It used to be easier. I moved to a different school this year than when I was at before. I used to be at what was called a year-round school, and we had breaks during the course of the school year. Like my comrades at the school that I used to be at, they're texting and saying, I'm going on vacation, hope you're enjoying your new schedule, things of that nature. So I missed that schedule. And those were the times that I would be able to go out and speak at schools that were still open. In October, we had extended break for Christmas. We had extended break for spring break, but it's very difficult for me to do that now. A supervisor told me that I was, and they said this, they were very angry and mad, that I was white trash. He was mad about that I would not wash the dishes at the kitchen. I never heard anyone say horrible words. When I heard this word, it sickened me. Words hurt. And it's like I said before, we are experts at hurting people with words. We as Americans, we love doing it. We love coming up with negative things to say about people. And this, I think, is very important for us to understand. We talk a lot about the issues that blacks have had in America. We very rarely talk about the issues that Native Americans have had, the bad things that have happened to them. The fact that Native Americans, the people who were here before any European stepped foot, did not become citizens until 1924. Black people became citizens before Native Americans did. We very rarely ever talk about what's happened to people who lived out west what used to be Mexico, that we now call California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. We very rarely talk about the things that they had to deal with. We very rarely even hear the stories of whites that have been discriminated against. I'm going to give you guys an example of to me, one of the most outrageous things that's happened to white people in America that most of us had never heard of before. During the 1920s, as the Klan was a very powerful organization, they believed in what they call 100% Americanism. And it was used by politicians. Teddy Roosevelt even used it as part of his campaign when he was running for president. They believed that everyone in the country should speak English. Shouldn't speak any other language. Even if it's your native language and you just got here, you better learn English within the next 4 hours if you want to be an American, right? And so this whole idea of 100% Americanism led to a law being passed. And what this law was the strictest immigration law in American history, passed, I believe, in 1924. This is what the law did. Prior to this law, all these millions and millions of immigrants had come to the country from all over Europe, right? And some had come from Northern and Western Europe, some from Southern and Eastern Europe. Well, these people who believed in 100% Americanism believed that these people from Southern and Eastern Europe should not be allowed to come to the country anymore. That they were defective white people, that they weren't as good as the rest of us. And so they had the law change, the immigration law change. And this is what the immigration law turned into. It turned into a quota system. And the way it worked was that we will look at the population on the 1920 census, and we'll determine how many Greeks are here. And the percentage of Greeks that are here today will be the percentage of Greeks we allow into the country every year moving forward. So let's just say 3% of the country were Greeks, right? That meant that next year, 3% of the people they allow into the country will be from Greece. If, say, 5% were Italians, 5% of the people allowed into the country would be from Italy. But this is what happened. A strange thing happened on the way to this law becoming this wonderful thing that everybody thought it would be. They realized that they screwed up. They realized that it was too many of those undesirable white people in the country. So what they did is they went back and they changed it. And they said, we don't use the 1920 census anymore. We're going to backtrack to the 1880 census before most of them got here. And so those quota numbers were lowered. So here we have a classic example that most of you have probably never heard this story of white people saying that some white people aren't desirable enough to be in the country. And that was the law of the land until 1965. When it finally changed, immigration reform in 1965. So we are a nation that loves discriminating against anybody we feel like discriminating against.
Awesome.
And there are no limits to our inhumanity to man. We just love being bad to people. And so to hear someone talk about being called white trash, the book, that's one of the controversies with the book. Is these people that they're talking about, this group of people that, you know, nobody wants to have anything to do with, these undesirable poor people, they're talking about what we would refer to as poor white trash. And a lot of people have made a big effort to say, listen, this book is talking horribly about this segment of American society, and that it's just as bad as the use of the N-word and the characterizations of blacks and things, because we're basically demeaning them as well. And so I think that's another thing that Harper Lee wanted to bring to the attention of Americans, is that we randomly choose people who have characteristics that they have no control over, and we choose to treat them differently than other people simply based on that characteristic.
You know, relative to this is a comment that I would hear oftentimes when I worked in Kenosha, and that would describe some of the rationale for the friction between the Italian people and some of the Hispanic or other Europeans who were South rather than German, or, you know, more white, as you could say, than these other people. And I couldn't believe it. It was just, I thought, dang, is there anybody that you don't hate, or who are you? You know, because it was Irish and all that. They were saying, and just by the way their skin looked, like it was ruddy and, you know, they didn't look clean. I said, well, who is looking at all this stuff? He said, well, you want an Italian from an area in northern Italy more than someone from Calabria. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I can understand, because I know a parent of a student who is from Calabria, and her skin is brown, almost as brown as mine. So I thought this whole idea of race is so wicked. It is
I completely agree with that. I want to share a resource with you guys that deals with that looks at the history of how different groups of whites have been treated. You guys heard of Eugenics movement?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now there is a website. It's the Eugenics Archive, I believe is the name of it. Just go to Google and type in Eugenics Archive. And what they've done is they put together a list of tremendous numbers of resources, newspaper articles, photographs, and a variety of different things. And they show how this elite members of society wanted to categorize everybody in the country, even categorizing whites. And one of the images I remember seeing is kind of it's like a step ladder, and it has a progression of people from the higher end to the lower end, and these are white people. So over here on the higher end, these people that are good people are the people from Scandinavia, Sweden, from England, things of that nature. And then as you go down this ladder to the lower classes of whites, you find the Irish, the Italians, the Greeks, things of that nature. And so, and it's very interesting to see those things and how prevalent they were, especially in the 1920s. I would advise you guys to check that out. It's a lot of great resources. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I taught in a school, all-black school in Shreveport, Louisiana. And when the school district would say they're going to get a new reading book, okay, our school, and it was a 7-year cycle or whatever, our school wouldn't get those. We would get the texts that were used at a white school, or white school would be brought to our school. And then the kids at our school, if they ever did get the new text, it was already old, and they were already adopting the new one. That was very, very, very common.
Just to kind of talk about the issue of textbooks, I just read this maybe 2 weeks ago. Someone sent me a link to the article. I believe it was South Dakota. They just passed a law in South Dakota about what can be taught in the schools there. And this will amaze you, because it amazed the heck out of me when I saw it. It is now illegal in the state of South Dakota. It may have been North Dakota, but I think it was South Dakota. It's illegal in the schools to teach about the Constitution, to teach about slavery, and to teach about Native Americans. It's illegal. Let me repeat that. It's now illegal to teach about the Constitution, slavery, and Native Americans. Imagine that. Imagine what's going to happen to those children in South Dakota if this is allowed to stand. It shows you the craziness of the times that we live in. Let me get to these last couple cards. The big read, To Kill a Mockingbird. Harper Lee, maybe not a. I'm having trouble.
Is that mine?
You warned him.
Reason to attack by others. I think they're talking about attacks on Harper Lee. Anybody remember writing about attacks on Harper Lee?
Yeah, I was thinking when you were talking about that perhaps she became kind of a recluse so that because she was threatened for having put this out there. It was just a thought that came to me.
I think from what I've read about her, she was just naturally that way. This is her first book.
Right.
And she wrote the book, but she didn't expect it to be this wildly popular book. And she didn't know that all of this stuff would come with it. And she just wanted
May I
to
have
live
your
a normal
attention,
life.
please? The library will be closing in 10 minutes. If you have any materials to check out or internet printouts to pay for, please do so now.
Let me go
Thank
over this
you.
last two real quick. What was the Civil War about if not to free the slaves? And most blacks fought in the Union Army. Now, 180,000 blacks fought in the Union Army, 20,000 in the Union Navy. Turned the tide of the war. Because the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the things that's in there that people aren't aware of is it gave blacks the right to be in the military. It gave them the right to arm themselves and be in the military. The Civil War, if you go back and read, the justification for the Civil War, and people have been lying about this since 1861.
Well, it's not about.
People say it's not about slavery, but this is what I challenge you to do, because I did it. If you go back and you read the secession documents from the state of Mississippi, Alabama, all of these states that seceded, read the secession documents, and they tell you very clearly why they're breaking away. And all of them state very clearly it's about slavery. We're breaking away because they're messing with our institution of slavery. So you can say, oh, it's about states' rights. Nonsense. Read what these people said themselves, and it gives you a very clear message. The Civil War would have never been fought had it not been for the issue of slavery. That's what it was all about. Now, I have to tell you, I've been trying. I can't read this. I can't. I'm sorry.
I know. Okay,
So-
you write it to be read. Well, this is my question.
Yes.
When Harper Lee wrote the book, she has a lot. Okay, so like she's got Black Velvet Negro in there. She's got other, the other stuff that's offensive. Was that the way? See, I don't know how to say it. That's why. Did she put that in there intentionally to point out that this is a problem, or is that the way she thought? I mean, really, the only thing that she was arguing against in her book was the way the courts worked, and all the other stuff was just something she didn't necessarily see a problem with. She was speaking. That's the way she thought. Right. Or was she writing those things as something else she objected to?
It was a period piece. She intentionally chose to put the story in 1935 to talk about the mindset of America at that particular time. So the issue she's talking about, she wanted it to be an honest interpretation of what was going on in 1935.
Okay, so she knew at the time that she felt that was offensive too.
Oh yeah, she knew.
Yeah, okay,
she knew.
that's what I wasn't.
She wanted it to be an honest interpretation. She didn't want it to look like it was phony.
Yeah.
Was that it?
Yep, that was it.
Well, they're about to kick you all out, and they're going to stick a foot in my behind. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and I will be back. I don't know when or what I'll be talking about, but I will certainly be back.
If anyone has